In the ancient city of Varanasi, where the sacred river caressed the worn stone ghats and the scent of incense clung timelessly to the air, the sun dipped beneath the horizon, bathing the city in a warm, golden glow. For countless generations, this city had pulsed with spiritual fervor, its temples resounding with hymns and the clang of bells, while devotees poured milk and scattered flowers at the feet of deities carved with meticulous devotion. Yet, beneath this outward sanctity, a silent question had begun to stir. It began in a narrow alleyway where time itself seemed to have stopped, crumbling bricks, faded walls, a forgotten corner of a sacred city. Here stood a modest mosque, far removed from the grandeur of the temples. Inside, whispered prayers breathed life into old stones, and outside, a young man stepped onto the veranda, brushing dust from his worn sandals. His name was Imran. He was neither a cleric nor a scholar, just the humble caretaker of the mosque and a teacher to village children, known more for his quiet kindness than for any scholarly credentials. Yet those who spoke with him often walked away with minds stirred and hearts awakened, not into turmoil, but into reflection. That evening, as dusk surrendered to night, an elderly man slowly approached the gate of the mosque. His steps were halting, his saffron robes weathered by time. It was Pandit Mahez, once a revered Brahmin priest, now merely a shadow of his former eminence. He had performed countless rituals, taught generations, and upheld tradition with unwavering dedication. But something inside him had changed, something unspoken, heavy, unresolved. Imran saw him and rose, greeting him with a soft smile. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the long wooden bench outside. Mahez sat down with deliberate care, his frail body trembling, not from the evening chill, but from something far deeper, something pressing from within. "I didn't come here to change my religion," Mahez stated plainly, breaking the silence. "You need not worry," Imran replied gently. "I never ask anyone to change, but if you've come seeking answers, I'll share what I know." The old man drew a deep breath. "I'm ill," he said. "The doctors say my time is short, but that's not why I've come." His voice dropped to a whisper. "What troubles me is a question. When I die, where do I go? What lies beyond this life?" Imran leaned forward, his gaze steady and kind. "That question," he said softly, "is not an end. It is a beginning. Whoever truly asks about death is beginning the search for the meaning of life." Mahez looked out into the fading light where jasmine perfumed the air and lamps flickered to life in distant windows. "For 50 years, I led prayers," he said slowly. "I taught my children to bow to idols, to light incense, to recite verses. But when sickness came and death crept close, I called upon those names, gods I had praised all my life. And there was only silence, not even a whisper in return." He paused, then continued, his voice brittle. "And I realized, I don't know if they were ever real." Imran nodded slowly. "Truth is not in how many times a name is spoken," he said. "It is in whether that name was ever truly alive." Mahez stared into the distance. "How can I know if anything waits beyond death, or if there is one divine presence at all?" Imran spoke with calm certainty. "Because when our hearts and minds are honest, they lead us toward truth. Look at the world, the rising sun, the perfect balance between night and day, the laws that govern all creation. None of this happened by accident. A being of immense intelligence and power made it all, not to abandon us, but to guide us. And this life, it is a test." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting his words settle like dew. "The good will be rewarded. The wicked will be held accountable. That is what justice demands. And deep down, we all crave justice." Mahez closed his eyes. "Your words, they make sense. They are simple, yet they strike deep." He looked at his trembling hands. "All my life I taught stories, of gods with blue skin, gods with elephant heads, gods who danced in rage, who married each other, who needed our offerings. But now, standing at the edge of life, those stories feel hollow. I search for truth, but all I find are symbols. Imran's voice was gentle. If we inherit tradition without questioning its truth, we are not seekers of wisdom. We are prisoners of habit. Mahis looked at him long and hard. For the first time in years, his voice quivered, not with conviction, but with fear. I came seeking answers, but now I feel as though I must reevaluate everything I've ever believed. Imran said nothing. He simply reached over and took the old man's hand, cold, fragile, but still alive. "It is never too late," he whispered. "As long as you breathe, you can still seek the truth." That night, Mahis returned to his modest home, dimly lit, lined with sacred books he had revered for a lifetime. The next morning, the sun rose over Varanasi, spilling liquid gold across rooftops and temple domes. Yet within the quiet walls of Pandit Mahis's home, a quiet storm raged. His eyes were heavy from wakefulness, but his heart carried a new lightness, an unfamiliar clarity. Surrounded by books he had once worshipped, he now read not to confirm his beliefs, but to challenge them. The verses that had once shaped his identity now stirred inner conflict. If the ultimate truth was that God could not be seen, touched, or imagined, then why had he spent his life sculpting images, bowing to them, singing to them, pleading with them? The thought didn't enrage him. It ached, like a wound ignored for too long. Outside, the temple bells rang as always. Devotees passed his door carrying garlands and incense. But Mahis did not rise to join them. Instead, he sat still, cradling the book he had once feared, now more precious than all the others. He turned again to the verse that had struck his soul. There is only one. He has no likeness. He was not born, nor does he give birth. He is beyond all comparison. And as he read those words again, he did not feel lost. He felt, at last, found. Muttering something under his breath, Mahis stood silently, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. A middle-aged man rose from the crowd. "Are you saying everything you ever taught us was wrong?" he asked. Mahis met his gaze calmly. "I'm saying, I never asked whether it was right." Near the back, a young boy hesitantly lifted his trembling hand. "If we've spent our lives bowing to things that were never meant to be worshipped," he said quietly, "then what have we done?" Mahis looked at the boy. Pain creased every line in his weathered face. "You followed because you trusted me," he replied, "and I led you because I trusted those who came before me. But trust, when never questioned, becomes a chain." Another student stood up. "Are you telling us to abandon our gods?" Mahis paused. "I'm telling you to ask yourselves, is what we worship truly divine? Or did we only believe it so because we inherited it?" A gasp escaped from an older woman seated nearby. "You dishonor your ancestors," she exclaimed. "No," Mahis said gently, "I honor them. But to honor does not mean to repeat their mistakes. It means to seek the truth they might never have dared to look for." The murmurs in the room swelled into agitated voices. Some stood in protest. Others remained frozen in disbelief. Yet amidst the growing unrest, a few leaned forward, their hearts drawn not by rebellion, but by revelation. One of the younger students, Ravi, stepped hesitantly toward Mahis. "We've had thoughts like these too," he confessed, "but we were afraid to speak them." Mahis reached out and clasped the boy's hand. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Truth may unsettle us at first, but in time, it frees us." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the temple as the main doors burst open. Several temple assistants rushed in, their faces flushed with panic. "Panditji," one of them called out, "the priests from the upper temple heard what you're saying. They're coming." Mahis stood tall. "Let them come," he said. I won't run from the truth anymore." But many around him were already retreating. Some of his students backed away. Others wept or shouted in confusion. The air filled with chaos. When the head priest finally entered, his expression was one of fury. He pointed directly at Mehi's. "This man has betrayed the temple," he thundered. "He spreads foreign ideas and insults our gods." "No," Mehi's responded calmly. "I speak only what is written in your own scriptures, that the divine cannot be shaped by hands, cannot be painted, cannot be born." "You speak heresy," the priest barked. "I speak reason," Mehes replied. From the back of the hall, a young voice rose. "Is it heresy to wonder if the God I worship truly needs milk every day to remain powerful?" Gasps filled the room. Laughter and outrage collided in a storm of emotion. Another voice chimed in. "If my statue can fall and shatter, how can it protect me?" The priests roared for silence. But something had already shifted. A seed had been planted, and it would not be unplanted. Mehes left the temple without another word. His steps were slow, but each was firm with conviction. As he passed through the crowd, people parted, some out of fear, others with reluctant respect, and many in quiet contemplation. He turned once before crossing the threshold and spoke. "Ask yourselves this. If your God can be carried, hidden, or burned, then is it truly God?" Then he was gone. That night, fire consumed his home. It wasn't strangers who came with torches. It was people who once sought his blessings, who once called him teacher. They came with rage and gasoline. The house where Mehes had grown up, where he had studied, prayed, taught, and wept, was reduced to cinders. Sacred scrolls, handwritten manuscripts, family photos, all turned to ash. They left no note, no dues. Rafi, one of Mehes' oldest students, stood in the corner of a local tea stall, anxiously turning a glass of chai in his hands. A neighbor leaned close and murmured, "They burned his house. They'll come for the rest of you next." Rafi replied quietly, "Then why didn't they answer his question before they lit the match?" The man had no reply. Elsewhere, a young woman named Kavya sat with her college friends. She had grown up learning temple rituals, but her voice now quivered with unease. "Have you ever wondered," she asked, "why we're never allowed to ask? Why it's considered wrong to seek the truth outside of what we're taught?" One friend shrugged. "It's tradition." Kavya leaned forward, eyes sharp. "But what if tradition is just the habit of the majority?" No one laughed. No one argued. That evening, in homes lit by dim bulbs and minds brightened by doubt, something remarkable began to take root. It wasn't a rebellion of slogans or fire. It was quieter and far more dangerous. It was thought. Across Vinasi and beyond, temples carried on as usual. Bells rang. Incense burned. Offerings were made. But within the crowds, more and more eyes no longer held certainty. They looked not with reverence, but with searching. Why did gods need food? Why were they angry? Why were they born? And why did they die like mortals? And perhaps, most painfully, why were people punished for asking? Down by the Ganges, a teenage boy named Nitin sat on the ancient steps holding a small idol. His grandmother had once told him it would protect him. But just last week, when his father fell ill and they had no money for medicine, Nitin had knelt, cried, pleaded. Nothing happened. Now he held the idol in his palm and whispered toward the sky, "If you can't even save one life, what power do you really have?" He didn't drop it, not yet. But he didn't pray to it again either. The shifting undercurrent did not go unnoticed. Local priests began convening in secret. Their concern wasn't just about faith, it was about control, influence, donations. Some called for outreach, others for enforcement. Soon, higher authorities intervened. A campaign was launched, not to investigate the truth, but to restore confidence and preserve national unity. Booksellers were instructed to report purchases of non-traditional texts. Teachers were warned against encouraging spiritual dissonance. Surveillance expanded. Lists were made. Names compiled. The first arrests came quietly. A teacher from a nearby village vanished in the night. His crime? Encouraging students to ask questions about divinity. A librarian disappeared after refusing to remove a translated scripture from the public shelf. Then one day, they came for Yusuf, once known as Romesh Chand, a respected university lecturer, not a preacher, not a protester. He simply hosted weekly discussions in his living room. In a modest home nestled in a quiet neighborhood, people of diverse beliefs used to gather every week. They didn't come to be converted, convinced, or corrected. They came to explore, to talk about life and death, justice, suffering, and the mystery of God. The man who hosted them, Yusuf, once known as Romesh Chand, believed deeply in the power of honest dialogue. He discouraged passionate shouting matches and warned against blind allegiance. To him, if a belief was genuine, it should withstand questions without the need for fear, threats, or punishment. But it wasn't enough. They came for him one evening, silently, swiftly, and without explanation. There was no warning, no formal charge, not even a moment to say goodbye. A black car idled outside as two officers in plain clothes stormed inside. Within minutes, the room was left overturned, books scattered, personal items broken or tossed aside. Yusuf was taken, forced into the back seat, and driven into the night. They brought him to an underground compound, a cold place without windows or clocks, just flickering fluorescent lights and the constant hum of steel and surveillance. There, in a room that smelled of rust and damp concrete, an officer dropped a thick folder onto the table with a thud. "You've been influencing minds," the officer accused, voice taut with accusation, "undermining national values, encouraging abandonment of heritage." Yusuf, bruises forming beneath his eyes, spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I have only encouraged people to think. Truth doesn't shrink from questions." The officer leaned in, his face hard. "Do you think this is a game? That you're some kind of prophet?" "I think," Yusuf said gently, "I am simply a man who refuses to pretend." Behind a two-way mirror, a younger officer named Dev Raj watched the interrogation unfold. He had joined the department after earning a law degree, full of ideals and a belief in justice. But now, as he studied the man across the glass, calm, bruised, yet composed, something in Dev stirred. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pity. It was discomfort. An unsettling awareness that, in the city of Yadia, an enormous crowd gathered in the public square, a space once known for festivals and processions. It was a warm afternoon, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. They hadn't come with flowers or incense. They had come with questions. The event had been announced as a truth dialogue, organized by top religious figures seeking to correct what they called a dangerous wave of spiritual confusion. But the intent was clear: to discredit a growing movement that had begun to challenge centuries of idol worship and seek connection with a formless divine. A grand stage had been erected. On one side sat Pundit Reganith, towering, charismatic, draped in saffron robes. A man revered for his eloquence and mastery of scripture. He had legions of followers in the crowd, waiting eagerly to see him defend their tradition. On the other side sat a young man dressed simply, Arvin, now known as Abdullah. Once a devout Brahmin disciple, he had quietly walked away from ritualistic tradition, embracing a deeper, formless spirituality. His calm, reasoned speeches had gone viral, especially among students and thinkers. He did not insult, he did not rage, he simply asked, and in doing so he had ignited something many had been afraid to name. At precisely 5 o'clock, Pundit Raganith began. His voice rang out, "We are not here to destroy, but to protect." What is unfolding across this country is not a return to wisdom. It is an infection, an infiltration of foreign ideas that seeks to sever us from our sacred past. For millennia, our ancestors lived with dignity, through karma, dharma, reincarnation, and the worship of our sacred deities. The crowd roared, clapping and chanting his name. Then Arvind stood, not with drama, with quiet dignity. He walked to the microphone, bowed respectfully to his opponent, and addressed the crowd. I was born into love, into rituals, mantras, and reverence. Every corner of my childhood home held an image of the divine, and I never questioned it until I did. He paused. I do not stand here because I hate my past. I stand here because I dared to ask, is what I worship truly divine? Or is it something carved by human hands? A hush swept over the crowd. I read our scriptures, he continued. Many describe the divine as beyond sight, beyond form, beyond comprehension, and yet we shape it in stone. We give it faces. We offer it food. We dress it. We store it on shelves and carry it through streets. If the divine is formless, why have we reduced it to something we can decorate? Pundit Raghunath rose at once. These are symbols, he thundered, representations of the divine, not the gods themselves. Arvind turned toward him, voice calm and piercing. If I hold up your photograph and say, this is not you, just a symbol of you, but I speak to it, bow to it, feed it, and call it my protector, would you feel honored or insulted? A ripple of laughter and stunned silence moved through the crowd. I do not mock your devotion, Arvind said softly, but I ask, if something can be damaged by rain, does it protect us from suffering? If we carry it in our arms, can it carry our prayers to the heavens? The questions hung heavy in the air. Pundit Raghunath responded with verses, chants, and poetic epics, but his words, though eloquent, felt distant, ornamental even, compared to the searing clarity of Arvind's logic. Then came the final blow. True faith, Arvind said, does not fear reason. If it collapses under questions, then it was never faith. It was fantasy. The silence that followed was different. Not confusion, reflection. Not emptiness, awakening. When the event ended, the crowd dispersed slowly. No winner had been declared, but something unspoken had shifted. In homes and tea shops, in buses and classrooms, people talked, debated, wondered. And in Hervar, a city of ancient temples, the unthinkable occurred. Thousands marched to the riverbanks holding statues, but not to honor them, to release them. There were no slogans, no anger, just quiet resolve. In the city center, deep pits had been dug. One by one, the statues were lowered in, not as desecration, but as farewell. An elderly woman stood at the edge, tears streaming down her face. For 30 years, I prayed to this idol, she whispered, but my soul was never at peace. Today, I am. A young man, barely in his 20s, raised a sledgehammer and shattered his family's idol. Not in rage, in release. You cannot carry me anymore, he said. I now walk with truth. Drone footage captured it all. The world watched in stunned silence. This was not a rebellion against spirituality. It was a return to it, stripped of intermediaries, symbols, and relics. What remained was simple, raw belief. The idea that the divine could not be bought, sold, burned, or boxed. The government responded quickly. Official statements called the events isolated, claimed foreign influence, declared investigations. But the Futa, this isn't a philosophy seminar, the officer growled. You're dismantling national harmony. You're corrupting minds. Finally, Yusuf raised his eyes. I'm not corrupting anything, he said quietly. I simply no longer worship what I do not believe in. The officer's face darkened. So, you admit it. You reject your own heritage? Heritage, Yusuf said gently, should be respected, but only if it's true. Otherwise, it's just a chain wrapped in nostalgia. Behind the one-way mirror, a young officer named Dev Raj watched silently. New to the force, clean-shaven, and idealistic, he had entered the department with a vision of serving justice. Yet the version of justice he now witnessed bore little resemblance to law or fairness. He had reviewed Yusef's file multiple times. No incitement to violence, no criminal behavior, only a widening circle of individuals asking questions about God, life, and meaning. And for that, this man sat beaten and shackled. Dev remembered something his mother once told him during his school years. Be cautious of people who punish others for asking questions. That's when fear replaces truth. Her voice echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. Later that night, Dev remained in the surveillance room long after his shift ended. On the monitor, Yusef now sat cross-legged on the cell floor, facing the wall. His lips moved gently, not in complaint, but in quiet reflection, perhaps prayer. His posture radiated peace, not the peace of comfort, but of clarity. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose, and yet someone who had found everything worth living for. A week later, the orders became more severe. Neutralize all who refuse to return to ancestral beliefs. Discreetly, permanently. Some officers obeyed without question. Others hesitated, stalled, made excuses. A few vanished quietly from duty. Dev found himself at a breaking point. That night, under the guise of routine security, he unlocked Yusef's cell and stepped inside. Yusef looked up, expecting another round of abuse, but Dev brought no restraints, no violence. He simply extended a cup of water. Without a word, he handed it to him, then sat on the cold floor across from him, mimicking the same cross-legged posture. There was a long pause. "I want to ask you something," Dev whispered. Yusef nodded slightly. Dev hesitated. His voice cracked. "How are you still calm? After everything, the beatings, the threats, the isolation?" Yusef looked into his eyes, soft and unwavering. "Because I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. When the truth becomes clear, peace follows. Not in the body, but in the soul." "But what if you're wrong?" Dev asked, his voice heavy. "What if all of this is just a mistake?" Yusef smiled gently. "If an idea demands silence, fear, and blind obedience, it's not truth. Truth needs no gatekeepers, just light." Dev stared at him. In that moment, something deep within him fractured, not with noise, but like a frozen lake cracking in spring. He had spent his whole life guarding shadows, and here sat a man who had chosen light. That night, Dev went to his quarters and wept for the first time in years. The next morning, he washed, put on fresh clothes, and sat alone by his window. No cameras, no audience, just a quiet whisper to himself. From that day, Dev was no longer the same. He didn't resign, he didn't make a declaration, but his actions changed. He treated detainees like human beings. He allowed questions. He looked the other way during prayer. In private moments, he began reading the book Yusef once clutched like a lifeline. And he wasn't alone. Across the country, others followed. Teachers, artists, minor officials. They didn't stage protests. They didn't shout slogans. They simply changed how they thought, how they prayed, how they treated others. Some removed statues from their homes. Others simply stopped bowing. Inside interrogation rooms, officers found themselves being questioned. Inside temples, priests watched the footfall dwindle. In classrooms, children wrote essays, not about gods with many hands, but about a single, shapeless source of existence. And still, the government pushed harder. More surveillance, more propaganda, more arrests. But the harder they pushed, the stronger the silence became. Not the silence of fear, but of reflection. A silence that didn't need approval. A silence born from truth. At the heart of this awakening were people like Yusef, bruised but unbroken, and Dev, once a loyal enforcer, now loyal to his own conscience. Between them were millions of ordinary people, not rebels, not prophets, just seekers, quietly turning their faces toward something vast, invisible, yet deeply real, toward a truth that could not be sculpted, contained, or threatened. A truth without a face, but not without a name. In Mumbai, the annual film festival dazzled as always with lights, red carpets, and photographers. But beneath the glamour, something intangible loomed. As if the city itself sensed actors began stepping back from divine roles. Some publicly renounced the myths they had once glorified. Others emerged in small town halls, libraries, and reading groups, no longer speaking of cinema, but of meaning. The transformation spread. In villages across Maharashtra, people gathered in silence, not to protest, but to question. In Kerala, former temple priests opened free learning centers for children, teaching them logic, ethics, and critical thought. The idols they once worshipped now sat boxed in corners, untouched, not because faith had died, but because something deeper had been born. The statues now sat untouched in dim storage rooms, relics of a reverence that had quietly moved on. In the town of Dujat, where generations of artisans had shaped gods from stone, the chisels had been laid down. Their leader stood before a gathering of peers and declared with quiet finality, "Let us continue carving beauty, but not illusions." The gods they once gave form to no longer held power over their hands or their hearts. Traditional religious institutions responded swiftly, trying to stem the tide. Statements were released in stern tones, warning of a deceptive awakening. They invoked ancestry, bloodlines, and sacred duties owed to the past. They appealed to loyalty and memory. But the people did not argue. They simply stopped listening. In the ancient city of Feni, once known for its grand rituals of purification, a profound transformation unfolded. Where worshippers once lined up to bathe stone idols with milk by the river's edge, rows of clean water taps now stood. Beside them were bookshelves, not altars. Evening after evening, a young man arrived to read aloud from a book that spoke not of many deities, but of one formless, invisible creator. People no longer came to wash away sin in flowing water. They came to wash away confusion with clarity. Back in New Delhi, government pressure escalated. Arrests multiplied, gatherings were banned, and voices of inquiry were labeled subversive. Seminar organizers disappeared from public view, and blacklists grew longer. But in the midst of it all, the people's quiet resolve stood stronger than steel. Their silence became their strongest shield. Every morning in a modest park within the capital, a group of women gathered. They had once made offerings in temples. Now they sat in a circle under open sky, sharing what they had read, what they had discovered. They passed around books that once collected dust behind locked cabinets. During one such gathering, a widow named Mina said with gentle conviction, "I used to pray to 10 different gods for 10 different needs. Now I pray to one, and for the first time I feel heard." This awakening wasn't total. Not everyone changed. Not every tradition was abandoned. But something deep had stirred in the heart of the nation. People who once bowed before crafted icons now stood with heads lifted, their hearts bending instead, not to form, but to truth. No one forced this shift. No bribes, no mandates. It was something organic, internal, a realization slowly rising within. They had not rejected faith. They had simply begun to see where it truly lived. God, they realized, was never confined to shape. He was not trapped in marble or metal. He had always been where truth resided, and truth does not demand offerings. It whispers in late-night questions, in silent tears, in the fragile courage it takes to step beyond what is inherited and toward what is chosen. India did not erupt in revolution. No flags were burned, no borders redrawn. There were no declarations of a new republic. Yet something had undeniably changed. The soul of the country, its pulse, its collective breath, had shifted. The temples remained standing, but many echoed with silence. Some mosques, once tucked away in hidden corners, opened their doors wide. They welcomed all, not to convert, but to converse, to understand. Among those who now walked in out of curiosity were former enforcers, those who had once ordered crackdowns in the name of harmony. In one small police station, an officer named Dev sat alone, reading. There were no commands in his ears, no surveillance screens before his eyes, just a worn paperback in his lap and the slow unfolding of thought. He hadn't resigned from his post, but he no longer obeyed blindly. When his peers questioned his restraint, he answered simply, "Because I finally started listening." A year passed, then another. The statues remained where they were, but the crowds no longer returned. Instead, a new kind of reverence emerged, one not directed at shape, but at formlessness, not handed down, but discovered, not performed, but lived. It made no noise, but its presence was unmistakable. People didn't announce their transformation. They didn't wave banners or take to the streets. They simply lived differently, quietly, with purpose. The nation, once celebrated as the land of 1,000 gods, began to be known for something else entirely, a land.